Welcome back, everybody, to Eurowatch, the number one show you need to listen to for this year's Euro 2021. We have a more informational show today, I think. It'll be a good entry point for some of you listeners. And if you're a new one here, first of all, make sure you follow us on Spotify, Google Podcast, Anchor, whatever you're watching or listening from, or YouTube. Secondly, just wait for us to get a couple things out of the way. For example, first things first, Mr. Ritwik Zakar, my wonderful co-host, with all the knowledge in the world, especially based off last week's research. How are you this morning?
It's a nice sunny day in San Francisco. United's results didn't go my way yesterday, but that's not the subject of today's podcast. Also, thank you for listening. Obviously follow us wherever you can, but it's always good to have anybody here to listen. And as Alex alluded to before, this is going to be a bit more informational, but it's going to be exciting too, because we're going to talk about this rather dubious decision of having the Euro 2020s take place all over Europe.
Yes, and just before we start, as always, we've got to get our shout out of the way for a pretty decent guess who we do every week, which is a player we will come up with behind the scenes. I usually come up with test the audience, and you can see if you can guess it. Last week's shout out was at _media campista, who guessed Danny Ings from last week's clues, which you can hear right now. I spent my youth at a club near the coast of England, but I didn't actually play for the team until over 10 years later. Second clue is, despite being one of the top strikers in England, I only have 3 national team appearances since my debut in 2015. Well done to you, sir. Stick around till the end of the episode for our clue. But of course, yes, as Ritwik alluded to, we're going to have a discussion about the rather interesting topic, and it's a rather open one still currently. Where should the Euros be hosted this year? Now, Ritwik, do you want to give a bit of background? I've got some things here. We like to tell the listeners what was meant to happen last year.
All right, I'll take you back. So these UEFA Euro Championships were or are marking the 60th anniversary of the tournament. I don't know why you would mark a 60th anniversary of anything, but they decided in all of their glory, let's keep it all over Europe. And the initial plan, which actually is the one that stands right now, has the Euros taking place over a 3,000-mile range all the way from Baku in Azerbaijan to Dublin in Ireland. Why Azerbaijan is considered part of the UEFA is something that still boggles my mind, but that's a political conversation I don't want to get into. So UEFA President Alexander Seferin reiterated the ruling body's commitment to holding this rescheduled European Championship this year in 12 cities across the continent. And the deadline to accommodate it, which they're also taking in fan opinions, is by early April. So as it stands right now, the Euros will take place all over Europe. And just to remind everyone, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. Europe is still reeling. So many different countries have so many different entry rules. And it's gotten to the point where Liverpool will not be playing their match with Leipzig in Leipzig because the Leipzig authorities failed to get the requisite clearance needed for an outside team to enter the country or the city.
I think that this will not go ahead personally. We might be proven wrong by April, but even people like Karl-Heinz Rummenigge from Bayern Munich has come out and said that from his knowledge at UEFA, they are desperately looking to actually host it in one country, despite UEFA making a statement recently saying they're committed to holding it in these 12 cities. But me and Ritwik have thought about this, and we're thinking it looks quite likely, even with the recent announcement, that the tournament could be held in one country, similar to as usual. So me and Ritwik have gone away and done our research and tried to come up with some areas we think could be the most suitable to host in it. Ritwik, I'm not sure if I imagine you've gone off a similar thing, but the way I've chosen my areas are based off vaccines. So how far ahead of the country in their vaccines, existing infrastructure, have they got the stadiums, etc., to prepare for the Euros on a major scale? That goes with available accommodation. Do they support? Can they have the hotels and etc. to support fans, teams, players who even may need to self-isolate before attending matches if they arrive kind of late to the country? I've got written down here having shit together, which we'll get into about the UK and maybe the EU, because
Which
I
becomes
think we
one of the
need,
most important points, actually.
yeah, away from the informational thing. I think that's my broadest point. COVID rates, of course, how plunged into the global pandemic is a specific country. I've also chosen to stay away from large countries personally, but I know you've gone with Holland and Amsterdam, so that'll be an interesting thing. Security threat as well, we'll be able to install decent security. I've come into that with Russia. And the weather. We don't want a Qatar situation where we're going to be playing in games where it's 40-degree weather. So I've actually
Well, I
chosen
guess
away from
a
Spain.
summer in Europe is always a good thing, wherever it
Yeah,
may
yeah.
be.
But Ritwik, do you want to start us off then? What give us some of the research you've looked into. Where did you want to start?
So I actually wanted to start in the Netherlands as a whole. Now it's always an interesting, discussion. Where should the Euros take place? And usually it's a it's a discussion about prestige. This time it's a discussion about a whole lot more. Now, just for some tiny bit of background, is all of the European Union, or at least most of them, are waiting for the vaccine from the Swedish British firm AstraZeneca, who, with Oxford University, are preparing COVID-19 vaccines for the rest of Europe. There has been a bit of a tussle between the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union because the UK so far has gotten their hands on more vaccines, even though they're also using Pfizer's. So Netherlands is one that I've taken primarily because um, they're slated to get a lot of those vaccines pretty early on, and the Euros can't be the Euros, or any international tournament can't be an international tournament without fans. And obviously, having fans in the league is in the domestic competition is also very important. But it's just sad when you think about having a tournament without fans in the stadium. And the Netherlands so far has been very cautious, has been very careful. They've got total case count of about 57,000, which for the bigger countries in Europe is quite low. It's only higher than places like Austria, Croatia, Slovakia, Hungary, um, and Ireland. But the Netherlands is a big pedigree team. They have an amazing team coming in. Their Obviously their lockdown rules aren't that strict. But the main point I'm coming back to is that they've played it careful. They have good organizational structure with their government, and their sporting infrastructure can handle this. They have stadiums ready to go. They'll probably have limited fan seating. I think that's something we're going to inevitably see because we're not gonna get herd immunity any time before this tournament. So it's a sort of the perfect blend of all those things. And this is probably going to be a recurring theme between both Alex and my discussions, is the amount of time that's needed for teams to quarantine. Now, if you listeners have been paying attention, they've loosened the quarantine rules for some football players and football teams because they're already in a COVID scenario. Now, the main thing will be whether the dates are adjusted or not, because obviously these teams and these players will need time after their domestic leagues to recover a bit and then come in. But I think the Netherlands holds the right crux of not having too many cases, having it under control, and being
My
able to
worry is though, do you
organize
not
a
think?
proper tournament.
So I've been to the Netherlands. I've been to Amsterdam, and I know obviously country's a lot bigger than just one city, but there's a lot. I'm worried about one. Obviously, you did mention there's going to be limited fan seating. I think that is a likely thing. So perhaps the size of a stadium is not too much of an issue. And the Netherlands generally is a very well organized country, and I believe they've got they've got a, unlike France, which is something I'm going to touch on. Their population is a bit more sensible, we'll say. But I kind of worry in terms of will they be able? It's been a long time, has it not, since the Netherlands hosted any sort of major tournament? Would they, like, they might have the stadiums, but would they have the things like available accommodation and the fact that I imagine lots of teams and areas will stay in Amsterdam, which is quite a close, busy city. I'm not sure about the travel links and
I
things.
mean, the Netherlands has Groningen, it has The Hague, it has Eindhoven, it has a few major cities, but I think the other thing is that mobility within the Netherlands is also very good. The Netherlands isn't that big of a country, so having mobility between stadiums and cities will not be that much of a problem as to say a France or a Germany or maybe even in England in certain ways. It's manageable commute. It's a commute that can be done securely. So that's like another reason why I think the Netherlands is probably a bit
Okay,
more primed for these
it's an
candidates.
interesting proposal. Before we continue a bit more, I'm going to write off one country because I'm not sure about any reports if Netherlands were rumored to host it. One country that's been rumored to host it as recently as December was Russia. After hosting the World Cup pretty successfully, they've been rumored by UEFA inside sources and different British media outlets to be preparing to host the Euros. However, recent events, I think, if some people may see things on the news, I'm just going to fill some people in. Recent events in Russia might put that to rest. Now, Russia's in uproar at the moment. I'm going to try and get his name right. I believe it's Alexei Navalny. He was recently been arrested.
Yes.
He was basically the opposition to Vladimir Putin. His arrest has recently caused riots in Russia, not seen since 2011 when Putin reinstated his power once more. The tension is incredibly high in the country, and as you said about the size of the country, I do think there needs to be a midpoint. I don't think you can go too small, which is why I'm hesitant about the Netherlands, but you can't go too
It's
big.
all Western Russia, like the World Cup. It'll all have to be just the European part of Russia. You can't hold matches in places like Vladivostok or
Of course,
anything
of
else.
course. But I do worry about Russia. I don't think while they've been reported, and if people were to look at potential European Euros hosting areas, the Russia may come up straight away. But I think recent events has tarnished that. Especially, I mentioned about security threat. I think with Russia right now, it's just a complete riot. If you bring a major spotlight onto the country, one, I think Putin's probably going to be against it at the moment, and two, if a major spotlight comes, and who knows what, a very large group of people who are desperate for intervention will do. So I think one thing I did want to, just before we get onto more countries, is eliminate Russia. But I'm
Yeah.
gonna head into England because you mentioned there about you slight hesitancy perhaps with some travel. I think England are one of the I think they are the standout personally. I'm gonna run through some things. So England have got one of the best vaccine rollouts in Europe. I think it is the best. They've vaccinated over 11 million people. I obviously live in the UK. Um, I will get onto some issues first, but the thing I think what the clear things England have going for it is definitely got the infrastructure in terms of cities, city stadiums, hotels, player accommodation. They are probably the most ready to support a major international tournament, whether there's limited fans or whether there's possibly even more fans, depending on the vaccinated population. And I think their country size to me is perfect sense just because there's multiple airports around the country. I believe you've got at least 4 in London. You've got more up north with Manchester, Liverpool, etc. So
Yeah, they'll probably have to center it down to about 4 stadiums. Wembley, Etihad, maybe Anfield, and one
yeah,
other. Like I can only see it happening in like about
I
4
do think
cities.
it's hard to talk about specific details like that. Even if it's 4 CCs, they'll be able to accommodate that. If it's okay, we need more. England can have Old Trafford set up, London Stadium set up, Wembley set up, etc. You've got loads of areas you can go to. I guess one of the issues, because for you, actually, Ritwik, what issues do you have first before I get into some of the problems? Because obviously you're a bit. What I like about this here is you're a bit more of an outsider. You live in America, so you're probably a bit more neutral, able to look in.
Yeah.
What's
As
your
a
thoughts?
caveat to all our listeners, I have also lived in England. I
Hmm.
spent I spent about a year and a half in Newcastle and Manchester. See, the way I look at it is this: England have on paper whatever you need to host a tournament. they've been they've also touted themselves as backup to the Qatar World Cup in case social political tensions force the tournament to move away from there. But yeah, so I think England do have it there. But Alex mentioned they're also the most vaccinated country. They're also the country within the European Union whose let the virus get to such a far point as well. And there's no telling, if that can come up again. Right now they're licking their wounds of being open during the holiday season and that increasing cases. It all depends on vaccine distribution, and I think UEFA are being a bit too positive, because I know UEFA are working on 4 operational scenarios: for full stadiums, for 50 to 100% capacity, for 20 to 30% capacity, and games behind closed doors. They've been come out. All of these host cities have been asked to come up with 2 to 3 plans out of those options, and they've been given a soft deadline of 5th March, probably going on from there. But it's with England, I always see the potential of something going wrong at
Yeah.
the worst time. England are also still economically reeling from both the pandemic and their decision to finally leave the European Union. There'll be a touch of delicious irony if, out of all these nations, England get to host the UEFA Euros,
After Bre-
since they
yeah.
are politically and economically out
Yeah.
of Europe. I don't think the irony will be lost on many people. I see England as a good destination for this. They've tried out systems of having limited fans in, but it's
Yeah.
all up in the
Just
air
to
right
just
now.
to hop in,
And
because you did. I wanted to hop in for. Well, you mentioned about there's a potential to go something to go wrong. Now, obviously, we've just said that on paper they are probably the best, and there are other good things as well. London's recently seen a migration of 700,000 people leaving, so it's actually almost a lot less crowded than it usually is. And it's also got a good climate. It's not as if the players are going to be sweltering in the summer, but the idea of something to go wrong, that is very, very true in terms of in the UK. It's hard to comment because obviously we're not in different countries, but living here, it was a frightening amount of people disregarding all COVID rules. It's become much more of a 50-50 debate of should we just drop all COVID regulations, etc. The only thing we've been good at is vaccinating. And again, Boris Johnson as our leader, whatever your political allegiance, everyone's criticised him at some point in the past 12 months because he's had a bit of. He's a bit like Dejan Lovren. He's got a clanger in him. Like, I remember when I was coming home from Amsterdam, right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, and just able to walk through an airport. 6 months later, my parents came home from a holiday, just able to walk through an airport. There's nothing. It does feel like there is always something they're missing. So that would be my only issue. But without waffling too much on about England, Ritwik, go on, bring another country to the table.
Well, I also wanted to talk a bit about Portugal. Now, Portugal is a country that has, I suppose, in the 21st century, really gotten their country's responses to various different medical issues, under control. Portugal's also been, heralded for their approach to narcotics, the more humane approach to recovery. Uh, they're a bit more of a humane but calculated society when it comes to medical emergency or big medical problems. The the obvious caveat is that they've had a fair few cases. They've had 137,000 totally,
Oof.
but the case counts have been dropping since December and January. It would be a very good advertisement for the country as well. As I mentioned, with the Netherlands, they have a very strong team. There is a high level of vaccine acceptance. Now, this is something that is not common throughout most of Europe and actually Western society. This might come as a bit of a surprise to some of our maybe uninitiated listeners, but there is a lot of vaccine skepticism that exists within Europe. It's not just confined to the American South, and that makes it a little bit worse, because if Portugal is slated to get the vaccine, in totality within the next 6 weeks, you can pretty much bet that their whole country would be vaccinated within
So
like 2 months. Their medical response teams have been
So
much
with
better than
Portugal, I
most.
mean, they stand out to me as a much different sense. They just hosted the Champions League with seen what seemed like a very successfully. I mean, I'm not sure. I think there might have been after the final, there might have been a COVID outbreak, but throughout the multiple games, I mean, they started some in the round of 16, went through the quarter, semi, final, went off without a hitch, it seemed. And there's a similar thing in Germany, where some people might be thinking about Germany could do it. Just to hit on them, they've had a very slow vaccination program. They've only administered 3 million vaccines in the country, so I've actually written them off personally. But Ritwik, what about from a sporting sense? Do you think they've got what it takes to host another major international tournament?
I think Portugal do, especially when it comes to managing the teams. Now, obviously, I'm going to preface this by saying I'm taking more into account the teams and their personal health. With fans, it might be difficult because Algarve, Lisbon, Setúbal, Beja, Evora, and Faro, and Porto and Braga. These will be the countries that will be the most concentrate.
Countries?
Sorry, these will be the cities that'll are likely to host these matches. But
Yeah.
again, I just see the process of Portugal being able to get their bearings together once the vaccine comes in.
How many vaccines have they had administered? Do you know?
They have had 250,000 vaccines administered so far, which is a low
Ooh,
number.
that is very low.
That is very
Oh,
low, but they also haven't gotten them. That's the thing. Their turnaround of vaccines gotten to vaccines administered is about 75%, which is good. And the thing is that we're likely to get different vaccines that are coming in. Right now, most of Europe is banking on 1-2 dose vaccine. If the Johnson and Johnson vaccine gets full authorization in the United States, you can see it spreading everywhere. That's a one-shot vaccine, which has probably a 94% efficacy rate to all the strains of
that's
COVID.
yeah.
So
I guess my just one fear from that though is just that they're already. It's a bit like Germany. The reason I wrote them off is just that even if they get their what was my quota, get their shit together very quickly, they're starting. It feels like very late in terms of a COVID sense. I feel like maybe from a sporting sense, especially after the Champions League, they're in a good position. And maybe the COVID cases doesn't matter because they managed to host Champions League well. But I feel like I don't know. It feels like they're starting from behind, And there's countries like England, even like the Netherlands, and like France, which I'm going to get into, that are starting a bit ahead.
hmm,
That'd be my one fear of it, I guess. Do you think?
fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
So who
I,
who
I,
else do you
I
have in your mind, Alex?
my last one was France. So straight away, when I thought about who can host the Euros, straight away my mind was France. They hosted it 5 years ago, so they're going. It's not as if they've lost a bunch of infrastructure overnight. They're going to be in a very capable situation, but there are some issues. Which I messaged Ritwik before which countries I was going to cover in, and he very rightly pointed out I believe there was a survey or something recently that saw about 40% of the country were anti-vax. Now I haven't managed to find that specific survey, but I've been looking into it, and yeah, they've got a very, very big anti-vax problem, which obviously
Massive problem.
is it's a bit of a comical issue. Like it's gonna create a few negative headlines for UEFA if they pick a country that's notoriously anti-vax to host a major international championship, major international tournament. But I guess to me, they've also got as well just to fill the listeners in terms of COVID cases and information. I think they've got round about the same amount of COVID cases as the UK currently does, with about it's around the same population. I think maybe slightly more. It's about 67 million or something like that. Can't remember the UK's off the top of my head. And obviously, it's a bit of a large country, but I think it's definitely going to be up there in terms of maybe it warrants a bit more investigation if they are able to do it. Did you have any other fears about France, like if they could host it or not?
Again, with France, I don't think their political situations the best. It isn't at the best stage right now. The country's still reeling from problems of trying to reopen schools, coordinating responses over all of their cities. France can hold a tournament. They do have the infrastructure for it. But I don't think the French people will be okay with the possibility of there being another outbreak because fans will be limited. I think that's the bottom line we have to draw from this is that you won't have stadiums packed with people, which also means that the rules for hosting an international game would be sort of relaxed. And just as a background to everyone is some countries are only picked for these tournaments or or even to host the UEFA Champions League final, if they meet certain requirements over stadium size, regulations, and a slew of other rubrics to be able to qualify to host a tournament game. Those will be relaxed, and that sort of comes quite well into my last point of
Yeah, go for it.
possibly having Sweden host it. Now, a lot of people know Sweden had a very lax approach to COVID. They didn't really shut everything down. They have U-turned on it a little bit now, and they do have the highest case count amongst their Nordic neighbors. However, their case numbers are so much lower than the rest of Europe. Right now, they're averaging less than, I think, 1,200 cases a day. Their 7-day average is about 1,400.
Okay.
And they have about 4 or 5 cities which can host these tournaments. And Sweden wouldn't have been considered before because they haven't really hosted a tournament on their own. I think they've hosted it with Denmark in the past. Sweden haven't hosted a tournament in a very, very long time because their stadiums haven't been, up to the capacity scratch. However, if that gets scrapped, then I think Sweden is a very, very good place to put it in. They've already launched a, digital coronavirus vaccine passport, which will allow travel in. Having that system sort of in place will be able to better inform any of the fans that are there. It'll be able to better inform the teams on how they might prepare or how they should prepare. And it feels like a safer place to hold a tournament if you're going to have an average of maybe 10,000 fans in the stadium, which right now is a pretty optimistic speculation. We'd obviously like to have more fans there, but we want the tournament to go through and we want it to go through safely. I think people will just have to take a hit and say, this tournament will be different, but we want to keep having the tournament. It's the same thing with the Champions League. It's the same thing with the Premier League. It's the same thing with everything else. Fans have resigned themselves to the fact that they're not going to be able to see their favorite teams live in person. But football must go on, and football has been going on, and it's quite remarkable that no major leagues have been stopped so far. There are arguments that they should have, but that's an argument for another day.
Yeah, that's fair. I think just about the fan thing, that is also another counterpoint against France. Obviously, someone who follows French football quite closely, it's another point against them. Their fans have been at times it feels like the pandemic doesn't exist. We've had Marseille being stormed recently. Nantes have fans storm their training ground and play circus music throughout them. I believe it might have been Nimes or someone like that. Maybe Nantes as well. Had fans come onto the pitch, surround the players in a big huddle, and chant at them in a rather intimidating fashion. Rams players earlier in the season, when fans were allowed in, they had no regard for social distancing at one point after an early season loss, bunched together. It feels like the passion in French fans might let them down too. But I like what you said about Sweden. It's nice to hear about how they U-turned as well. It seems like they've U-turned quite successfully there. It'd be interesting to see where this goes. I think that's good. Do you know if there's been any reports of Sweden? I couldn't find any, but again, it feels like your shouts have been quite more left field. Has there been any other before we finish? Has there been any reports of them?
Reports of what?
Reports of UEFA looking at them or them putting themselves up.
No. But the other reason which I didn't touch upon is that AstraZeneca is a Swedish and English-based company. So Sweden has a lot of responsibilities on the manufacturing front, and you can bet that half of the company will want Sweden to get the vaccine sooner rather than later. And all the Nordic countries have a brilliant healthcare system in place to be able to vaccinate their own populace. So honestly, even if we have, limited numbers of foreign fans coming in, I think the Swedish fans themselves can, fill up the stadiums and have this wonderful thing that, hey, I can cheer for Sweden, but I can also cheer for another team. It'll be one of those, outlying tournaments that will be in pub quizzes for ages, as will every football event of the last year.
That's fair. Okay, I think that'd be a nice point to end it there. Let's see. It'd be interesting to hear some people's thoughts. We're going to make sure this goes out to as many more people as possible. Hopefully a new way to get new listeners in. We're also going to stave off the Guess Who for this week and continue it next week just so we can refreshen that segment. But thank you very much for listening today. Alex and Ritwik. Bye-bye.